And now I would like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Branka Marijan. She's a senior researcher at Project Plowshares and board member at Peace and Conflict Studies Association of Canada. At the Project Plowshares, Branka leads the research on the military and security implications of emerging technologies. Her work examines ethical concerns regarding the development of autonomous weapon systems and the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on security provisions and trends in warfare. She holds a PhD from the Basili School of International Affairs with a specialization in conflict and security. She has conducted research on post-conflict societies and published academic articles and reports on the impacts of conflict on civilians and diverse issues of security governance, including security sector reform. Today, Branka will talk about the battle for control, the struggle to regulate military AI and autonomous weapons, where she will share with us her candid assessment of the challenges which meaningful global regulation of AWS are facing and the urgent need for action. Let's welcome Branka Marijan together.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Alexandra and Christian. It's, this was a level of organization I think that no AI could top in the weeks leading up to this. So I think you've done a great job. It's such a pleasure to follow Joshua and Sarah because they've kind of set the stage, but they've smartly decided not to focus on some of the governance things. So I'm going to do that today. And I promise, if you're not a policy person, I'm a policy geek, it can be fun and interesting. So hopefully I can make this of interest to you. I titled this The Battle for Control because it really is, I think, what is happening now in terms of the issue of autonomous weapons, and as Sada talked about, in terms of the broader applications of AI in the military domain. There really is a struggle to both shape the governance processes and also, to sort of impact the kinds of technologies we're seeing on the contemporary battlefields. So I'm going to just talk to you briefly about some of the key trends. You're quite aware maybe of some of these, maybe perhaps not about some others. Then the role of tech companies that we haven't touched on so far, but I think they play an incredible and an increasingly important role. And then some of the lessons that we're seeing so far from the contemporary applications. Again, with the caveat, as Sarah said, I mean, we're basing all of this on information from investigative reports, secondhand accounts, discussions on the sidelines of UN events. So we're kind of compiling all of this information, but I do think there are interesting insights from both sort of humanitarians and defense analysts, which will help us kind of understand the types of governance that we need. And then I'll focus on the picture of international governance. And my claim at the end, and I'm going to give away the ending, which is probably bad storytelling, but my claim at the end is that we're going to need a multi-layered governance response. So I'm going to pick apart some of these governance responses for you, but my claim is essentially that we're going to need all of this and more to deal with the type of technology that we're dealing with and the sort of the transformations of warfare that we're seeing. So what are some of the key trends? Technological advancements in the civilian sector are increasingly being looked to by militaries around the world. Lots of small militaries are interested in AI tools and technologies as force enablers. Smaller countries would like to see how they could utilize this technology. Again, the role of tech companies has become an interesting dimension in this discussion. There has always been, an intertwined relationship, particularly in the United States, between the Silicon Valley and the Defense Department, but it was a different kind of relationship than it is now. What we're seeing also is an accelerated development and deployment of AI-enabled military systems. That doesn't mean that these systems are thoroughly tested or they're necessarily efficient or even achieve necessary military aims. However, they are being deployed. We also have competing governance processes and a lack of political will in the context of the great power competition. So I don't know if you've seen this recently. This is from Peter Kyle, the Technology Secretary of the UK, who said the Britain must treat tech giants like nation states. And the role of the tech sector in the military domain has become really important, particularly related to the use and deployment of AI, because it is the tech sector that has the know-how, and as Sarah was talking about, the hardware, the technological capabilities really are in the hands of a handful of companies in the US in particular, but also a handful of companies around the world. So these actors are playing an incredible role. I really don't think we should treat them as new nation states, and I think it's important to criticize the fact that though these tech companies might have the technological know-how, governments still have a role to play. And so this has been an incredible challenge to communicate the need for governments to develop regulations and to be responsive with the regulations they develop. The reason there has been a bit of a lax environment in some of this, of course, are economic benefits. You've all probably heard the claim that AI will determine the state power, the future state power. It was, I think, first said by Putin in something like 2018. And then repeated by so many others ever since. So AI has really been put at the crux of state power. And so the fact that the UK says something like this, and a technology secretary at that, I think is really concerning in terms of how we're thinking about what's possible in terms of actual governance. Then we have the fact that these companies aren't just on the outskirts anymore. They aren't just sort of building tools and things that, you know, are being applied perhaps by militaries. It's not a simple adoption of some of these tools. There's an active involvement of these actors into the defense context. And they are playing an important role in what Sarah talked about, this critical data pipeline. These tech companies not only have the data, that's necessary sort of for militaries or the tools to examine the vast amounts of data the militaries have, but also the fact that they have lots of data available from different sources and citizens around the world. So it is a really troublesome relationship and lack of regulation that currently exists. And even companies, I remember the heyday of the principles, the responsible use of AI, do no evil, Google days. That sort of sentiment, that kind of mindset has shifted incredibly. And I think there's been a critique, particularly in the US, of somewhat more, I would say, concerned mindset or human rights mindsets that have suggested that perhaps Google shouldn't be involved in projects like Project Maven, that has said, no, we need the brightest minds to build the sharpest tools. And there has been this real sense of patriotism and nationalism that is shaping, what is the role of these tech companies and what is the role of tech workers themselves. And there's been, I think, a real stifling of tech activism within these institutions, within these companies that we've seen over the last few years. So that sort of critical space, even particularly within these giants, has shrunk significantly. So that has all happened, and then we have seen the use of these tools and technologies, in particular in Ukraine and Gaza. In Ukraine, the lessons have been that these tools can be really effective at perhaps guiding munitions. They make munitions something like 10 times more effective, according to some reports. Again, as Sarah said, we're basing all of this on, maybe Palantir's PR team is that good because they have claimed that they've been so central to Ukrainian capabilities of fighting back. But nonetheless, they have played a role. Ukraine has been seen as a test lab for these technologies, both by these external actors and companies, but also by the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainians really do want to see this sort of tech-forward future for the country when this conflict ends, and sort of a defense tech sort of context emerging after the war. So it's not just sort of these companies going in, they've been welcomed in, and there is domestic capability as well in the Ukrainian context. Despite the sort of the tech angle, there's not a day that goes by without AI-enabled drones in Ukraine making the news in some way. The reality on the ground still is somewhat questionable about the role that these technologies are playing in ultimately shifting the conflict context. Ukraine, at the end of the day, still needs what militaries call mass, right? It needs individuals to go and fight. There are high desertion rates. There's, these people fighting on the front lines in trenches, are very tired, disillusioned, and there is very little support for these troops. And so at the end of the day, the fact that you do have tech weaponry and these high-tech systems being tested does not change. I will make this claim, and maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A, does not change the realities of warfare on the ground very much, not at this stage anyways. Ukraine, the way in Ukraine has used AI tools perhaps differs than what we've seen in Gaza, and this is where the point Sarah was making about speed and tempo of war changing or being possibly changed by these technologies is really important to acknowledge. What we've seen in Gaza is the use of AI decision support systems that have enabled an increase in targeting. So again, based on reports, something like, the Israeli Defense Forces went from having about 100 targets a year in Gaza to having about 100 targets a day. The incredible increase has also had devastating impacts on civilians and civilian casualties. And what we've seen there, again, according to reports, is that there was a decision made that for even like a low-ranking Hamas operative, something like 15 to 20 civilian casualties were acceptable. So there's a shift in the norms and an incredible challenge of what we've sort of focused on with international humanitarian law being enabled by these technologies, and of course not in a good way. And that is, I think, an important thing for us to reflect on. When a nation feels attacked, when it feels under pressure, when it feels like it needs to react and show its strength, the impacts of these technologies in those kinds of contexts, in those kinds of moments, can result in really devastating realities for civilians in particular, but the increase in speed, because again, states might want to show that they can fight back, or they might want to exert that force to show strength. So those are some lessons that we're learning so far that are concerning, I think, but that are important for us to keep in mind, because when I started following the issue of autonomous weapons in 2015, and I know some of you in the room and online have been there along with me, I joke that we've aged prematurely in that discussion. The fact that these systems would lower civilian casualties was often discussed, and it still is. And I think what we're seeing with the early deployment of some of these tools and technologies is an important reminder that we need to consider the types of contexts and the political realities of the conflicts and conflict zones that we're dealing with that I think will serve us well. Now on to you, maybe the more boring stuff, but to me the really interesting nitty-gritty stuff, which is the governance. The good thing is states have focused on the issue of autonomous weapons since 2014. And through the UN processes, but we've had an increase in the discussions and focus and recognition, precisely what Sarah was saying, that we have AI being used in both autonomous systems or weapon systems and in applications beyond. So what we have so far are non-binding, right? We use that term, voluntary principles, voluntary guidelines, voluntary things, but they nonetheless, I would argue, form the structure of what should emerge as sort of a multi-layered process, governance process, that does include both international and national regulations and rules and norms, as well as codes of conduct for tech companies, for tech workers. So I'll start with the broad level first. So what we have here is the political declaration on responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy. The reason I'm starting with this US-led initiative is because I think it's an important sort of recognition of the wider scope of the issue, so that this particular sort of document is aiming to bring countries together to address issues like accountability and transparency. So Canada, alongside Portugal, is co-chairing a working group on accountability and transparency, where it's really trying to understand what does accountability actually mean? How do you ensure that there is accountability? Does that require certification processes and recertification processes? Those kinds of aspects of this political declaration, I think, are important. They are still being held amongst the like-minded and the somewhat like-minded. So the sort of supporting states of the political declaration are generally U.S. allies and adjacent. So it does not feature, the more adversarial nations, and certainly doesn't feature China. But that might not be the goal of this document. One of the sort of aims of this effort is to bring the somewhat like-minded together to try and build this understanding of what should be sort of a part of a broader governance framework, and to build share knowledge in terms of how even allies are using these technologies. Because it's important to recognize, even within an institution like NATO, there are vast differences in capabilities and even know-how. So there's an effort to try and understand what are sort of the common principles that can be agreed upon by these various states. The political declaration was released at the first HRAIM summit, the Responsible Military AI Summit. The first one was held in The Hague, Netherlands, and the second was held actually just a few months ago. I was in Seoul. The Republic of Korea hosted the second iteration. HRAIM is an effort that was sort of led by the Netherlands and Korea, and has been now been supported by various states. You've heard about the blueprint for action that was supported by some 60 states, but not by China. That was the outcome of the recent one. But the interesting thing is the first HRAIM summit, the program of action there, did include China. So it was seen as an important positive step, because HRAIM is a multi-stakeholder group, multi-stakeholder meeting. So it does include states, it includes academia, civil society, industry. So it's trying to be this sort of representative space. Why do I mention that? Because the US-led political declaration is state-focused. So HRAIM is this effort to bring a wider number of actors together to work through some of these issues. Where is HRAIM going next? I don't know if anyone knows. We're all kind of hoping it's somewhere nice and that we see some development. But at the moment, there's a bit of, I think, an identity crisis with this process. Where does it go, and what is it really ultimately able to achieve? The big selling point initially was that it was a place where China could come and talk to the more adversarial states about these issues. So on that one, I think we have to wait and see. But I do think it's an important process nonetheless. The much maligned CCW, or the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, has been an important point of discussion. I know I often sort of am mean to the CCW, as are others. However, when this issue was discussed in 2014, quite a bit of the things that we're talking about now have been discussed at that time. So I think it's important to recognize the CCW has been an incubator. The challenge with CCW, the rules of procedure, it functions by consensus. And consensus used to mean that we're all equally unhappy with an outcome. But consensus now means that we expect unanimity, and that it's almost like a veto power, right? And that shift hasn't been helpful. There's stumbling blocks within that process. Russia, particularly, has been quite loud, both literally, they're very loud, and figuratively in that space, trying to sort of say this issue needs to stay within the CCW, because, of course, if things function by consensus and consensus has become vetoed, then that means they can control what happens or what doesn't happen within that process. So the CCW, I think, has been a good place to have this discussion. I cannot tell you how many times I sit in these discussions on military applications of AI, and I think, we had this discussion in 2017. or we had this discussion in 2018. So it's been a long time. There's been a lot of knowledge that's been built, particularly for smaller states. This forum has been really useful because they might have one individual who has to cover, the gamut of arms control and disarmament issues. So that forum has been, helpful for that, but it is, I think, increasingly everyone recognizes the time to move on from that discussion. A small win for me in Canada is that Canada has moved on from saying that the CCW is the most appropriate forum to an appropriate forum, which you can see how sad being a policy person is, because that small shift is, I think, significant because it recognizes the fact that we could potentially take this issue out of the CCW. So if we take this issue out of the CCW, where do we go? The UN General Assembly is one possible venue. The UN General Assembly has now had 2 resolutions on autonomous weapons. This is the Resolution 77 recently voted on. And you can see that 161 states are in favor on sort of having more discussion on lethal autonomous weapons essentially happen within this kind of setting and forum. None of the resolutions that we've had so far within the UNGA are ambitious, and that's by reason. I think it's important to start that dialogue on where does this issue go forward if it goes outside of the CCW. The problem is that there's no political will. The issue isn't one of lack of legal expertise or technical expertise or military expertise. We have all of that. We could craft, I think, and I'm sorry to the lawyers in the room, but we could craft an excellent treaty tomorrow based on the knowledge that we have that will be future-proof, that will cover a lot of what we sort of find challenging. That's not the issue. The issue is really political will, and sort of against the background of the geopolitical competition between the United States and China, it's become really difficult to sort of consider what are the options, going forward. I will say, I said it at the outset, that I will suggest that we respond with a multi-layered governance framework, and that does involve some sort of international legally binding instrument, that sets out the red lines, the very red lines, how we get there. I know it's going to be difficult, but a legally binding instrument that clearly states whether it's human control or appropriate care that the United States has suggested or other terms, and that is agreed upon by the greatest number of states, including more adversarial states, even if they don't follow it. I know this critique will come, but Russia and China, I know. We can figure this out diplomatically. It can be a bilateral agreement that's followed up on between the United States and China, There are other mechanisms. But what that broader international treaty would signal is that these are the clear lines. These are the red lines. So no matter how amazing AI becomes, that we say we don't want it, targeting humans in some sort of setting where there's no other human present or no human control. And so we can come up with those. My claim would be that we can come up with those kinds of agreements and that we absolutely need to. That international agreement can be very broad. It does not need to get into the nitty-gritty. And then we build upon that. We build upon that with processes such as HRAIM', where we talk about somewhat more problematic maybe uses, but not as problematic as the deployment of force. You can build upon it with other initiatives, domestic law, some of the back-end office function, HR, the use of AI for recruiting. Those kinds of things are going to be governed by domestic laws anyways, right? So we need to layer this process. And finally, maybe a call to you, because I think some of you tech workers, tech companies have a role to play in this as well. And those can be codes of conduct that complement these processes. But I think the greater clarity that we have from the actual states and regulators in shaping this process will be critical to ensuring that we have civilian protections in place. Because what we've seen so far is that conflicts have become a lot deadlier, for civilians in particular. What we've also seen so far is that there's been an undermining of international humanitarian law and laws of war, And those norms, those rules, those laws, they don't exist ethically, right? They depend on implementation, on support from the very countries that are looking to deploy these technologies. So there needs to be this sort of vision of how do we build that level of governance, ultimately is in the interests of the states themselves, because no state wants, non-state armed groups to get a hold of some of these tools and technologies. And some of this they will. We just know that we won't be able to control. But we want to be able to control the most sophisticated systems, the most sophisticated technologies from falling into the so-called wrong hands. And we can only do that if there is international regulation in place. So I've been more hopeful today than in the past, but I do think that this is a critical point to stress that regulation is possible. It's just whether we will be able to come up with the political will domestically and at the international level to act upon it. Let me end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Let's see which questions are in the room and online. We can start with in person.
Thanks. So you mentioned like one red line might be like making decisions without a human's involvement, essentially. How concerned are you about like humans being only, let's say, nominally involved, and how do you prevent that and make sure that there's like meaningful human involvement? So if it's advantageous to just let the AI make decisions autonomously, you can imagine humans just being reduced to the role of like very quickly pushing the yes button.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's been really interesting in the CCW discussion is that we've also noted the fact that systems can be designed in ways to nudge us to accept certain decisions. And so I think there's a real need to consider the issue of automation bias, all of these discussions that we've had over the years. And I think particularly in a high stress conflict context, militaries want speed and they want to respond quickly. And I think that's what worries me, is that we're going to deploy systems that maybe haven't been tested or certified for particular contexts, and they're going to provide us speed, and we're just going to accept that because in a war zone you want to react. There are people shooting at you, and there are these systems that you develop in labs or that might be developed in Ukraine. If they're used in a different country, how effective are they in these contexts, from geography to the types of wars that you're fighting? There's not a war from IKEA that you kind of build up and you say, this is these are the pieces and this is how you react this way. I mean, it's an organic, dynamic context, and what we've seen so far with these technologies is that they don't respond well in that kind of context. And couple that with the sort of the need for speed in response, I'm really concerned that the kind of control that we might accept is going to be not necessarily meaningless completely, but not sufficient to deal with the tasks that it's been given.
Just a brief follow-up. So you mentioned something like putting in place some process or designing the system such that there's meaningful control. Like, I was wondering what that looks like. Like, what it conjured in my mind is the idea of like the human has to, demonstrate that they have some understanding of the decision they're making by like answering some questions correctly before they're allowed to approve or otherwise act on the decision recommendation or something like that.
It could be, I think we absolutely need training. So we need the individuals deploying the systems to have been trained on the systems, to understand to have a level of understandability and predictability. And let me plug, I forgot to plug this essay series that I co-edited with Dr. Leah West for the Center for International Governance Innovation. We have some great papers examining some of these issues, and I think that we have this understanding of, you need understandability. If you're going to deploy force, you need to know what kind of system you're using. And how does that, uncrewed platform perhaps interact with this crewed platform, with this AI-enabled platform? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of that training and that commitment. And I think states can and militaries can be very clear about what they mean when they say, okay, we have a human in place, right? Like, who's that human? What is their role? Like, those kinds of questions, I think, are the ones precisely we should be focusing on in the governance discussions. And we have a level of understanding.
Thanks.
I'll take the next question from online. So someone is asking, could you speak more about potential roles for tech workers in supporting strong regulation of military applications of AI?
I think one of the interesting things that's happened on this file, particularly autonomous weapons, the reason it came into the international discussions was because it was individuals who were being asked to build some of these systems that then started interacting with international civil society to say we're really concerned about what this means. So I think from the very foundations, this issue has had the role of these tech workers play an important role. And I absolutely think they should and need to play an important role because we need the technical expertise and we need people who are reflecting on what they're building. That you probably all struggle with that question of like, should we build it? Like, we can build it, but should we build it? So I do see tech workers as playing a great and an important role, and maybe one that they don't want to play, because some of them are like, we just want to build a technology. There was a conference, years ago where a Google engineer said, "Hey, I'm just an engineer. Like, I did not sign up for this ethical, legal stuff. That's the political science people over there." So I think that's going to be harder because I think tech workers are going to be playing an important role, and sometimes a role they're not always aware of because some of this interaction isn't always clear because the technology is what we say dual use or multi-use. So I do absolutely see these individuals as playing a great role in this governance discussion, whether they want it or not.
I'll take the next one in person.
Hi, Andrew Smart from Google. And I do want to be aware and play a part. I just had a question kind of about, people had mentioned hardware, and I was wondering if there's discussion, on the integrated global economy and the chips are often the bottleneck to making these things. And of course the supply chain is incomprehensibly complex with all different players and governments. And is there discussion, no AI system can be built unilaterally in one country. You need data labelers, you need chips, and this is all integrated in this really complex logistical system that happens very quickly, and it's beyond the understanding of any one organization even. So I was just wondering how that plays into discussion among states who have companies who have interests in manufacturing, labeling, etc.
So that's great leverage, right? If you're something like ACML in the Netherlands, right, you all of a sudden become sort of the center of this geopolitical struggle between China and the United States. And ACML, really does have a chokehold on that part of the market. The most sophisticated chips cannot be built without their machinery, right? And they're very specific about their machinery, even when exporting to the United States too. So I think that the semiconductor discussion is one that's become really prominent in the United States in terms of policy leverage that you can do is you can put in export controls and try and curtail developments that way. But then with anything, China will try and respond and is trying to respond with different kinds of chips that it's trying to build with what it has available. And that's going to be the reality of warfare. There's going to be states that come in with these tools and technologies, and the adversaries that they're dealing with have every intention to, have every need to respond somehow. So we're going to see that on the battlefields. But in terms of the actual states, they're quite aware of that. That's sort of the economic, I would say, discussion, and the sort of the hardware discussion is constantly in the background because the United States did put pressure on the Netherlands to, put those export controls in place and stuff. So there's going to be a lot of that leveraging. But I really like your point because I think it points to the interdependence of the supply chain and the fact that if we see more export controls, I think the IMF has estimated that something like 2% of global GDP will shrink, like 2%. It's significant. So the flip side of this military competition is that it's going to impact all of us and the economy, or like the global economy. So absolutely, I think something that needs much more discussion. I wrote about semiconductors, and I think it's fascinating. Most people don't think semiconductors are interesting, but I think the broader public needs to be aware of that dynamic at play.
So just so you know, now it's supposed to be a coffee break on schedule, but we can take maybe one more question online and make the break a bit shorter. We really want to start the panel on time at 11:15. So there's one question online about the CCW also being an incubator for political will, which did happen with both landmines and cluster munitions. And as we move from it, do you see political will growing?
Yeah, I think states will want to be a part of a successful thing. So we absolutely need to take it out of the CCW, but which countries will do that? So I think we need to encourage the middle powers, which have generally kind of sat back and let, you know, the great powers kind of take the flak for their competition and let the, you know, the disruptors take the flak. And the middle powers really have, including Canada, have sat back and not played the role that they usually play within these processes. So if we can get those middle powers to start moving this process in a more positive direction, I think there will be a lot of will. And the other states are going to want to join in some way, if for no other reason but to try and disrupt or shape that process. And that in itself, I know sounds counterintuitive, but it will be helpful to us.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I invite the remaining people who have questions to interact with Branka during the coffee break as we prepare for the panel. Thank you very much, Branka.
Thank you so much.